What is God complex syndrome and why it is more dangerous than you think? There is a type of person who walks among us, invisible to the untrained eye. Yet their presence can alter the course of lives, organizations, even entire civilizations. They are not necessarily evil, nor are they always aware of what they are doing. But they carry within them something dangerous, an unchecked belief in their own superiority, an inability to accept failure, a relentless need to control, dominate, and shape the world in their own image. This is the essence of the God complex, a psychological state where an individual sees themselves as infallible, beyond reproach, almost divine in their perception of reality. And the most terrifying part, many of them don't even realize they have it. But let's take a step back. What does it truly mean to have a God complex? It's more than just arrogance or egotism. It's a mindset where a person believes they are above the rules that govern others. They see themselves as the chosen ones, the enlightened leaders, the only ones capable of understanding the complexities of life. But their decisions, in their eyes, are not just right, they are absolute. They don't simply think they are intelligent, they believe they are incapable of being wrong. They don't just seek success, they believe they are entitled to it. And when things go wrong, they never take responsibility because to them, failure is not a reflection of their own limitations, but the fault of those who failed to recognize their greatness.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Think about the most dangerous leaders in history, the ones who led nations into ruin, who justified cruelty in the name of their vision, who silenced dissent because they saw opposition as an attack on truth itself. What do they all have in common? Not just power, but the unshakable belief that they were the only ones who could wield it correctly. They saw themselves as the architects of fate, the authors of destiny, the ones who knew what was best for everyone. And when people suffer under their rule, they do not see it as a consequence of their actions, they see it as a necessary sacrifice for a greater good, a good only they can define. But here's where it gets even more terrifying. The God complex is not limited to dictators, CEOs, or cult leaders, but it exists in everyday life, in people you might know personally. The boss who refuses to listen to feedback because they believe their vision is untouchable, and the friend who manipulates those around them, believing they understand what's best for everyone. The parent who controls every aspect of their child's life, convinced that their decisions are the only correct ones. The partner who refuses to acknowledge mistakes, always shifting blame, always rewriting history to make themselves the hero. These people might not wield armies, but they wield something just as powerful: psychological control. But here's the question we don't ask enough. What happens when a person with a God complex is successful? When their arrogance is rewarded, when their belief in their own invincibility is reinforced by victory after victory. But this is when they become most dangerous, because now they have proof to themselves that they were right all along, and that their way is the only way, that they are, in essence, untouchable. And this is where the real damage begins. When arrogance becomes power, the rise of the untouchable mind, the most dangerous moment in a person's life, is not when they fail, it's when they succeed without consequences. Because when someone with a God complex achieves victory, when their ideas go unchallenged, when their control is reinforced by results, they stop seeing themselves as merely intelligent or capable. They start seeing themselves as inevitable. They begin to believe that their success is not just earned but predestined, that their ability to shape the world is not a skill but a right. And from this belief, something even more dangerous grows: the idea that because they have been correct in the past, they will always be correct in the future. This is where we see the most extreme forms of self-delusion take root. The person with the God complex does not just ignore criticism, they see it as an attack on truth itself. They do not simply dismiss other perspectives, they see them as obstacles to progress. They begin to surround themselves with people who reinforce their worldview, who act as an echo chamber, who feed their illusion of perfection. And if anyone dares to challenge them, they are not just wrong, they are enemies, fools, betrayers who must be silenced or removed. The idea of being questioned becomes intolerable, because in their mind, to question them is to question reality itself. But here's where it turns truly dangerous. The more they succeed, the more they believe in their own infallibility. And the more they believe in their own infallibility, the more risks they take. They stop listening to advisors, to experts, to anyone who does not align with their vision. They make reckless decisions, convinced that their instincts are beyond human error. And when those decisions start to backfire, they do not adjust, they double down. They find scapegoats, they rewrite history, they shift blame onto external forces. Because to admit failure would mean admitting that they are not gods, but flawed human beings. And that is something they simply cannot accept. This is why the most destructive figures in history did not start out as villains. Many of them began with good intentions, with a strong vision, with a sense of purpose that others rallied behind. But over time, as their victories stacked up, as their influence grew, as fewer and fewer people dared to oppose them, they lost the ability to see themselves as anything other than supreme. Their minds became fortresses, impenetrable to doubt, resistant to reflection. They became prisoners of their own delusion, incapable of seeing the walls they had built around themselves. And in their desperate need to maintain control, they became the very thing they once fought against: tyrants, manipulators, deceivers who no longer cared about truth and only about maintaining their own myth. But here's the terrifying part: this does not just happen on the grand stage of history. It happens in everyday life, in relationships, in workplaces, in communities. The boss who refuses to acknowledge mistakes because their past successes have convinced them they are beyond error. The friend who manipulates those around them, justifying it as necessary for the greater good. The parent who controls every aspect of their child's life, convinced that they alone know what's best. The partner who never apologizes, who always finds a way to twist reality until they are the victim and you are the villain. These people may not rule nations, but they rule the minds of those around them. And the longer they go unchecked, the more destructive they become. So here's the real question: how do you deal with a person who believes they are untouchable? How do you protect yourself from someone who has convinced themselves that they are always right? The answer is not simple, because logic does not work on someone who has abandoned reality. But you cannot reason with a mind that refuses to see itself clearly. But there is one truth that always remains: every empire built on delusion eventually collapses. And when it does, the people who once seemed invincible are often the ones who fall the hardest. The illusion of invincibility, when the God complex begins to crumble, the most dangerous thing about the God complex is that, for a time, it works. It grants the illusion of power, the illusion of control, the illusion of destiny unfolding exactly as it should. But illusions, by their very nature, are fragile. No matter how carefully constructed, no matter how deeply believed, they always have a breaking point. And when that moment arrives, When reality finally pushes back against the delusion, the person who once seemed untouchable finds themselves standing on a foundation that was never as solid as they thought. But here's the thing, people with a God complex do not simply admit defeat. They do not wake up one day and realize they were wrong. That would require the very thing they have spent their entire existence avoiding self-reflection. Instead, when cracks begin to form in their carefully constructed world, they respond in the only way they know how, with denial, with rage, with an even more desperate need to assert control. They refuse to acknowledge the consequences of their actions, insisting that the failure is external, that the world is conspiring against them, that the people around them have betrayed them. They lash out, they rewrite history, they double down on the very behaviors that led them to this moment. And in doing so, they accelerate their own downfall. This is why some of the most spectacular collapses in history have not been caused by external enemies, but by the very leaders who once seemed invincible. The dictator who becomes so paranoid that they turn against their own allies. The business mogul who refuses to listen to warnings until their empire crumbles. The religious leader who begins to believe their own divinity so completely that they push their followers to destruction. In each case, the same pattern emerges: the refusal to see reality for what it is, the inability to accept limitations, the desperate need to preserve an image of perfection even as everything falls apart. But what about in everyday life? What happens when the person with a God complex is not a ruler or a public figure, but someone close to you, a friend, a partner, a mentor, a parent? The answer is no less devastating. When their illusion begins to crack, when reality forces them to confront their own imperfections, they do not seek understanding. They seek control. They manipulate. They gaslight. They find ways to make others feel responsible for their failures. And if that doesn't work, they retreat into isolation, cutting off anyone who refuses to feed their illusion. They would rather destroy relationships than admit fault. They would rather be alone in their delusion than surrounded by people who see them clearly. But here's the paradox: the more they try to hold on to power, the more they lose it. The more they try to control others, the more people begin to see through them. Because no matter how much fear or admiration they inspire, no matter how convincing their narrative, the truth has a way of revealing itself. And once the illusion is shattered, it cannot be rebuilt. The people who once followed them, who once believed in their infallibility, begin to walk away. The influence they once wielded begins to fade. And in the end, they are left with nothing but the wreckage of their own making. But now comes the most important question of all, the one we are often too afraid to ask. If the God complex is so destructive, if it leads to inevitable downfall, then why do people fall into it in the first place? What is it about power, about control, about the belief in one's own superiority that is so intoxicating that even the most intelligent, the most capable, the most well-intentioned people can become trapped by it? But the answer lies in something deeper than arrogance, deeper than ego. It lies in the fundamental human fear of uncertainty. Because here is the truth: the world is chaotic. Life is unpredictable. But no matter how much knowledge we acquire, no matter how much control we believe we have, there will always be forces beyond our understanding, beyond our influence. And for some people, this is unbearable. The idea that they are just another flawed human being, subject to the same randomness, the same limitations as everyone else, is too much to accept. And so they create an illusion of certainty. They convince themselves that they are different, that they are above the rules that govern others, that they alone have the power to dictate reality. It is not just about power, it is about safety, about the desperate need to impose order on a world that refuses to be controlled. But that safety is an illusion. No one, no matter how powerful, is immune to the forces of life. No one is beyond failure, beyond doubt, beyond the consequences of their own actions. And the more someone tries to deny this truth, the more violently reality will correct them. Because in the end, the universe does not care about the stories we tell ourselves. It does not care about our delusions of grandeur. It only operates on one unbreakable law: actions have consequences. And for those who refuse to see themselves clearly, those consequences will always come whether they are ready for them or not. Escaping the illusion, the only way to defeat a God complex. The truth about the God complex is that it is not just a personality flaw. It is a prison. A beautifully constructed, self-reinforcing prison where the person inside believes they are free, while unknowingly tightening the chains around their own mind. The deeper they sink into their delusion of superiority, the more they cut themselves off from reality, from truth, from genuine human connection. They build walls, not to protect themselves from others, but to protect themselves from the terrifying realization that they are not gods, that they are not infallible, but that they are just as vulnerable as everyone else. And in doing so, they become the very thing they fear most: isolated, lost, and ultimately powerless against the forces they tried to control. But here's the hardest question of all: can someone with a God complex ever truly escape it? Can they break free from the illusion before it destroys them? The answer is not simple, because the only way out is through something they have spent their entire existence avoiding: humility. True humility is not just about admitting mistakes. It is about fundamentally changing the way one sees the world. It is about accepting that no matter how intelligent, how successful, how powerful you become, you will always be limited by your own perspective, by your own biases, and by the simple fact that you are human. It is about realizing that control is an illusion, that certainty is a myth, that the real strength does not come from imposing your will upon the world, but from learning how to move with it. But humility does not come easily to those who have spent a lifetime believing in their own invincibility. It requires something that is often more painful than failure itself: self-awareness. It requires looking in the mirror and seeing not the godlike figure they have constructed in their minds, but the flawed, imperfect, vulnerable person underneath. And this is why so few ever escape the prison of their own delusion. Because to do so would mean tearing down everything they have built, everything they have believed, everything that has protected them from the fear of being ordinary. And for many, that fear is greater than the fear of destruction itself. But for those who do escape, something incredible happens. When the illusion is shattered, when the walls come down, when they finally let go of the need to be right, to be perfect, to be untouchable, they do not become weaker. They become stronger. Because now they are no longer fighting against reality. They are learning from it. They are no longer isolated by their own arrogance. They are connected to others in a way they never have been before, not as rulers, not as superior beings, but as equals and as fellow travelers trying to navigate the same uncertain world. And this is where the real lesson lies, not just for those who suffer from a God complex, but for all of us. Because the truth is, we all have moments where we fall into the illusion of certainty, where we believe we know more than we do, and where we resist change because it threatens our sense of control. And while most of us may never reach the extremes of those who are fully consumed by the God complex, we are all susceptible to its pull. The difference is in whether we recognize it when it happens, whether we have the courage to step back, to question ourselves, to accept that sometimes we are wrong, and that being wrong is not a weakness, it is a path to growth. So the real challenge is not just in identifying those who suffer from a God complex, but it is in making sure we do not fall into it ourselves. It is in constantly reminding ourselves that the greatest wisdom comes not from believing we have all the answers, but from understanding that we never will. It is in embracing the uncertainty, the imperfections, the endless complexity of life, not as something to be feared, but as something to be explored. Because in the end, the ones who truly shape the world are not those who believe they are gods. They are the ones who understand that being human is enough.